Peter Knights is the executive director of WildAid, a conservation group that works to reduce demand for wildlife products. And he explained how research on black bears can help giant pandas.
Well, although pandas are sort of not as critically endangered as they were a few years ago, it's still very important to expand the panda population. And so anything that can help is to be welcomed. I think right way back in the 60s, there was a lot of work with the World Wildlife Fund and China cooperating and collaborating, the panda, of course, being the symbol of World Wildlife Fund. So it goes back a long time with regards to pandas. That was really, I think, probably the first major international cooperation, although there have been things like Per David's deer as well, where people from London and London Zoo cooperated with the Chinese government way back in the 50s and 60s.
Would you say that there is a lot in common between black bears and giant pandas? How much can they really learn from one another?
Well, they're not that closely related, but I think they can from the behavior, from taking animals out into the wild, from having them accustomed to being with human beings. And of course, there's one school of thought that we shouldn't intervene with wildlife and just let it do its thing. But unfortunately, the humans are intervening all the time with animals, and so usually on the negative side. So I think if there's some way of positively influencing things, it's not a bad thing.
Would you call this animal diplomacy? How important is international cooperation? And does it impact negatively or positively relations between China and other countries?
Well, I think, yeah, China has been accused of panda diplomacy sometimes with its program to take pandas to zoos around the world. But I think nature and conservation is a great area for international cooperation. Obviously, the animals know no borders. And I think what we find in our work is very often, if you can take a best practice from one part of the world and introduce it to another part of the world, that can be very useful because, you know, very often with wildlife, we're just beginning to understand the ins and outs of how to manage wildlife, how to look after it, how to breed it. And so if somebody's been doing it somewhere else or something similar, there's a lot of lessons that can be learned.
What are some of the challenges with these type of relationships, for example, when it comes to cultural differences or even different scientific methodologies?
Well, I think the world's shrinking from this point of view. Decades ago, there were sort of major differences between here in the United States, for example, and what biologists would be doing in other parts of the world. But I think nowadays with the internet, people are logging on to methodologies a lot sooner. Standards are much more standardized across the world. So I think it's much easier to do now, and even language-wise, it's much easier to do now than it was previously. And China, I think, has been welcoming international cooperation, welcoming people to come in and work, as well as sending Chinese abroad to study and to learn things from other countries.
Peter Knights, always great to hear your take. Thank you so much for joining us.